80%. That was the number tournament officials were hearing at first. 80% of the ticket inquiries pouring into the Mubadala DC Open were supposedly connected to one player. Not the top seed. Not the defending champion. Not one of the established American stars. They were asking about Alexandra Eala. And then tournament chairman Mark Ein looked closer at what was happening and made the point even stronger. It wasn't just most of the interest. It was virtually all of it. Think about how wild that sounds. A 21-year-old Filipina ranked number 28 in the world walks into Washington, D.C., and suddenly becomes one of the biggest stories at a tournament loaded with recognizable names. And within days, the conversation wasn't simply about whether Eala could win matches anymore. It was about something much bigger. Has women's tennis reached the point where its biggest crowd magnet and its highest-ranked player are no longer the same person? To understand how Washington got there, rewind about 72 hours. Eala arrives in the nation's capital carrying a world ranking of number 28 and gets an opening round matchup against Zheng Qinwen, the 2024 Olympic gold medalist and a Grand Slam finalist. On paper, that's the kind of draw where experience is supposed to matter. But before a single official point was played, tournament officials were already getting their first clue that this week would be different. It happened at practice. Eala stepped onto a side court Monday morning for what should have been a routine warm-up. On the court next to her was Naomi Osaka, a four-time Grand Slam champion and one of the most recognizable athletes in tennis. Normally, Osaka practicing nearby would pull every camera in the area. Not this time. Filipino fans were packed along Eala's fence. Phones were up. Philippine flags were everywhere. People weren't waiting for a scoreboard or a marquee matchup. They had shown up for practice. No ranking points. No prize money. No dramatic third set. Just Alex Eala hitting tennis balls. That's when Washington started realizing what it had on its hands. And the contrast with the very top of the women's game was impossible to ignore. World number 1 Aryna Sabalenka wasn't playing Washington, choosing instead to focus on the stretch leading toward the bigger North American events and the US Open. Normally, a top player skipping one tournament wouldn't mean much. But Sabalenka's 2026 season had already included several public battles with the structure of professional tennis. She had spoken about the demanding schedule, openly questioned tournament decisions in Miami, and became one of the loudest voices in the ongoing debate over Grand Slam revenue and player compensation. Then came Wimbledon, where Naomi Osaka knocked her out in the fourth round. Sabalenka walked into the press room frustrated and emotionally drained, joking that she wanted to forget about tennis and get completely drunk. Sabalenka had spent much of the year challenging the system from the top. Eala, meanwhile, was quietly becoming one of the system's most valuable attractions. Washington put that contrast under a spotlight. And then Eala backed up the hype on court. Across the net in round 1 stood Zheng Qinwen. Olympic champion. Grand Slam finalist. A player with serious power and experience. Zheng took the first set 6-4, and she held the advantage deep into the second. For a while, the match looked like it was following the expected script. The proven player was taking control, and the younger challenger was running out of room. Then everything flipped. Eala caught fire. She stayed composed while Zheng's level started slipping, and once the momentum changed, Alex didn't let it go. She stormed through the closing stages and completed the comeback 4-6, 6-4, 6-1. The crowd erupted. And the handshake at the net immediately became part of the conversation. It was quick, cold, and businesslike. Zheng turned toward the umpire almost immediately, creating another courtside moment fans dissected online. It reminded some viewers of Eala's earlier encounter with Yelena Ostapenko, when frustration also became visible during a match against the Filipina. Whether those moments mean anything deeper is open to interpretation. But one thing isn't debatable: players are beginning to understand that facing Eala comes with a completely different atmosphere than it did a year ago. Now look at how quickly the week developed. One day, Eala has fans lining up around a practice court while Naomi Osaka is right next door. The next, she's completing a 3-set comeback against an Olympic gold medalist. Then tournament leadership is openly talking about the enormous demand surrounding her appearances. For Filipino fans who have been watching this build since her Miami breakthrough, that's important. Because for months, people outside that fan base could dismiss the excitement as national pride. They could say Filipinos were simply supporting their own athlete. But when American tournament officials start talking about ticket demand, when former American professionals start discussing her drawing power, and when her matches keep creating packed court atmospheres in different countries, it becomes harder to write the entire thing off as hype. The gap between Eala's ranking and her commercial appeal is becoming part of the story. And Steve Johnson saw it coming. Johnson, a former top-level ATP player and U.S. Olympian, now appears on the Nothing Major podcast with fellow retired American stars including Sam Querrey and John Isner. During a discussion earlier in 2026, Querrey asked the question directly, had Alexandra Eala become a bigger attraction than names such as Aryna Sabalenka and Coco Gauff? Johnson's answer was yes. And he didn't stop there. He compared the atmosphere around Eala to what Brazilian sensation João Fonseca created on the men's tour, packed outside courts, standing room-only crowds, and fans showing up regardless of which stadium organizers placed him in. That comparison matters because Johnson isn't Filipino. He doesn't have a national reason to promote Eala. He was simply describing what he saw. At the time, the claims sounded bold. Washington made it look a lot less bold. But this story goes beyond one tournament. Eala may be exposing a change in how modern tennis creates stars. For years, the formula was fairly simple: climb the rankings, win the major tournaments, become famous, then sell tickets. Social media and global fandom have changed that equation. Now a player who activates an enormous new audience can become commercially important before reaching the very top of the rankings. Li Na showed what connecting with the Chinese market could mean for women's tennis. João Fonseca is showing how powerful Brazilian support can be on the men's side. Eala may be opening a similar door across the Philippines and Southeast Asia. That doesn't mean the competitive side no longer matters. Far from it. There are still questions she has to answer. One of the biggest was another meeting with Leylah Fernandez, the defending Washington champion who had beaten Eala in straight sets earlier in Stuttgart. That's the beauty of professional tennis: hype can fill the stands, but eventually you still have to beat the player on the other side of the net. And Eala knows it. She wasn't pretending her losses never happened. Fernandez beat her. Jasmine Paolini ended her Wimbledon run. There are still levels she has to climb and weaknesses she has to improve. But after the Zhang comeback in Washington, Eala explained something important. The ability, she said, had always been there. The difference now was experience. She had trained these situations over and over, and she was finally reaching a point where she trusted herself to execute under pressure at the highest level. That's a dangerous development for everyone else. Talent is one thing. Talent combined with belief is something different. So rewind the picture one more time. A practice court in Washington filled with Filipino supporters even though a four-time Grand Slam champion is practicing next door. An Olympic champion leading the match before Eala turns the momentum around and runs away with the third set. A tournament chairman confronting ticket demand that appears completely out of proportion with Eala's ranking. And former American pros saying months earlier that her ability to draw crowds may already rival the biggest names in women's tennis. That's the bigger story. Aryna Sabalenka still owns the number 1 ranking. Coco Gauff remains one of America's biggest tennis stars. Naomi Osaka remains a global icon. Nobody needs to tear those players down to recognize what's happening with Eala. Because popularity isn't a ranking point. And ranking points aren't ticket sales. Alexandra Eala is showing that the two can move on completely different timelines. The next tests will be even bigger. Washington was one stage. The US Open offers another, especially if organizers start putting Eala on one of the major stadium courts in front of a huge New York Filipino community. And then comes another fascinating measuring stick at Indian Wells in 2027, where California's massive Filipino population could create an atmosphere unlike anything the tournament has seen for a player still trying to establish herself among the game's permanent elite. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Eala doesn't have to become world number 1 tomorrow for this phenomenon to matter. She just has to keep winning enough matches to give millions of people a reason to keep showing up. So here's the question: if Alexandra Eala continues making deep runs at major WTA events and starts regularly receiving stadium court assignments at tournaments like the US Open, how long before the rest of women's tennis openly acknowledges that one of its most powerful crowd attractions came from outside the traditional superstar pipeline? Drop your prediction below. And make it specific. How far do you think Eala can climb, and is she already one of the biggest draws in women's tennis regardless of ranking? Because the people who started following this story early have already watched it move from Filipino excitement to international conversation. Now the numbers, the crowds, and the results are starting to speak for themselves.